Hello, everyone, and welcome to this KeyShot webinar. We're really excited this week. We have KeyShot 6 beta preview to show everyone. And presenting is Richard Funnell, our global training specialist, and he'll be taking you through a lot of the new features that we'll have in KeyShot 6. Maybe not every single one, but you'll get a good dose of what's to come. And if you have questions along the way, Sean and myself will be here to answer those. And with that, Richard, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. Hey, everyone. Thanks for dialing in today to go through this overview of the KeyShot 6 beta. This is pretty exciting. For those of you who aren't familiar with some of the new features that are going to be coming out in KeyShot 6, make sure to take a look at our website. So if you go to keyshot.com, we have an area for KeyShot 6. That's the window I've got open right now. And I'm showing this because we have a video that is a good preview that shows some of the new features that are going to be in KeyShot 6. We're going to be going through those today, as well as a lot of images created by our beta testers under the KeyShot 6 gallery. A big thanks to all of our beta testers who have been absolutely essential for trying out new features and coming up with some really, really cool images. So if you haven't seen this on the website, definitely check out some of these images created in KeyShot 6. One of the questions that I know it's going to pop up almost immediately is, when is KeyShot 6 coming out? I'll just go ahead and tell you that we're looking at a late summer release for KeyShot 6. So we don't have a definite release date, but we are looking at later this summer. So I don't know if there's like a collective sigh or shaking fist going out right now, but that's the answer I've got for you. Okay. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to cover a lot of the new features. We're not going to cover everything. There's so much that we won't be able to get through everything in full detail within the next hour that we've set aside. But we've broken up the new features into improved workflow efficiency, more material control. We've got some brand new capabilities, and then also some enhancements to existing features. So this covers everything from lighting presets to material graph and more control over your materials, a brand new lighting algorithm. So those of you doing architectural and interior work, this is going to be good. And then lots and lots of tiny things, everything from a easier to use move tool to controlling the field of view within your animation. So without spending too much on just talking about the stuff, let's go ahead and jump into it, right? So for those of you who haven't used KeyShot before, this is going to be more of an intro to the new stuff. I'm not necessarily going to be going through how to use KeyShot. This is really just to show you what to expect with KeyShot 6 when it launches later this summer. All right. And I hope everyone can see and hear okay. We're also going to be recording this, so if you ever want to refer to it and come back later, you can definitely do that on our YouTube channel. So I've got KeyShot 6 open right now, right? So I've got an existing scene that I just had open. We're going to go through and try to recreate something like this. But first of all, I want to mention that KeyShot 6 is kind of an evolution of what we've done with KeyShot 4 and then KeyShot 5, right? So it's not going to be completely radically different from what you've seen before. We're going to be adding a lot of new stuff, but nothing is going to be crazy different. Even some of the really complex features that we're adding, like the material graph, are still somewhat hidden, so you have to kind of unlock some of those. So for those of you who are worried about this getting too complex, we definitely are trying to keep it from getting too insane while we're working. A couple of quick things before we actually import a model and start talking about it. We made some changes to our project window, right? So you may notice that we now have a new lighting tab, right? So all the way on the right, it used to say settings. This is image, right? So we've made some adjustments here to our project window, and let's talk about some of those changes that were made. This model here, so it's an assembly with a couple of parts on the inside, right? One thing that we've added, which can be really nice, if you don't want to actually be able to modify your parts, their position, or the materials, is the ability to actually lock parts and models on your scene tree, right? Which can be really helpful. If I were to select a part here, for example, and then I right click on it, and then I lock it, And if I select that part, you can now see that some of these options that were there are no longer options that I can select, right? So if you set up your scene and you've got your materials perfectly and everything that you want perfect, right? Locking things is a really easy way of making sure they don't accidentally get messed with, especially when we start talking about scene sets, because scene sets are going to be a lot more complex way to present your KeyShot scenes, right? So small thing, but pretty cool. Another thing that we added with that locking ability is I could right click and I can hide and lock, right? So if I do that to that part, right, and then I'm going through and I'm turning off parts as I'm assigning materials and things like that, right? Now if I right click and I show all parts, you'll notice that all my parts pop up except the one that I told to hide and lock, right? So those visibility states are also going to be respected when you're working with your lock, right? So when you start working with a really complex assembly, I know a lot of viewers do, right? That will allow you to have a little bit more control over those parts in your scene tree. Another thing that we've added within our scene tree is the ability to filter, right? So under show, right, you could always search, but now you can actually filter between parts and lights. Those of you working with physical lights in the scenes, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on, right? But now this is an easy way of actually filtering those, because since we apply light as a material to an object, your lights are going to be pieces of geometry here in your scene. So it's a small change, but something that's really, really nice. In your materials, right, so your in-scene materials, you could always toggle between a list view and an icon view. But something that we also added is the ability to actually filter by or list by the material type, right? So if you've got paints and metals, plastics, right, that's another really small thing, but it's a nice little addition. And those of you working with scene sets, which are part of our Pro package, you'll be happy to see that you can now filter your materials by the scene set or by visibility, which is really handy, so that you're not accidentally working with materials that you don't intend to within that one scene. Right, so those are just some small updates that we've added to, well, they're not small, they're pretty significant, right? But those are some updates that we made on our scene tree, right? The material tab, this is going to get a little bit more complex with the addition of the material graph, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But the material graph is going to allow you to make much more complex materials. And again, we'll get into that later on down the line. The environment, we've changed the HDR editor button, so now it's actually a button instead of the giant invisible button, which people didn't necessarily easily see, right? So now when you start working with your custom environments, right, you just click that button. This will bring up the HDRI editor, right? So lighting, we'll get to this in a little bit more detail later, right? But instead of your lighting settings belonging under your settings tab, now we actually have that defined with a lighting tab in our project window. And as you can see, there is an interior setting and a full simulation setting. So we'll talk about those as well. We made some additions to the cameras, the ability to do shift lenses. So that's one new adjustment here. Things like standard views. Now it's actually called standard views. So when you want to work from a standard view, you can quickly pull it in that way. Right. And then lastly, the image, right? So instead of this being the settings, right, this is where we can control all of what we see in our final image. For example, the vignette, right? So if you've used the vignette before, we can drop in a quick vignette. Something that is new is the ability to change the color of the vignette. That can also be really helpful for trying to actually put this onto a presentation, right? So if we have a white vignette on our outside borders, then when I actually copy and paste this into my, let's say, a PowerPoint presentation with a white background, I don't have those shadows clipping, right? So there's some good stuff in here as well. One brand new thing is the ability with Pro to actually do real-time region rendering, right? Because let's say you're working with a material that takes longer to render, like a translucent material or something that requires higher ray bounces, right? And this machine here, I've running on 46 out of my 48 cores, right? So I've got a really, really great workstation here. But if I wanted to focus all that rendering power on one area, I can enable region rendering, right? And now I can actually use this window here to define where KeyShot's going to be focusing my render power, right? So the region rendering is awesome. So when you get those more complex materials in a complex scene and you just want to see how that translucent material works, real-time region rendering is a really nice new addition, right? Okay, so those are some of the kind of general overview items. So let's go ahead and actually import a model and let's start talking about the new stuff that's popped up here. Okay, so I'm just going to create a new scene, right? So I'll go up to File and hit New, and let's just import a model. Same one that I just had up, right? So we're going to work with an NX assembly. Okay, so I'll go down to my toolbar down on the bottom. Let's go ahead and select one of these parts. So you can see this is the master assembly file, and then I'll go ahead and open that. And let's take just a quick minute to talk about some of the new changes that were made upon importing. One that you'll notice is that there is no longer scale, right? So this has been a point of confusion before. If you ever imported multiple CAD models into KeyShot, and let's say you were having issues with scale, right? Now, whenever you bring a model into KeyShot, everything is working off the original model scale. So that's nice. There's no more automatic scaling, right? Another thing that we've made, or another addition that we've kept, another addition that we put in here is the material and structure, right? So by default, KeyShot would always keep the structure of whatever your 3D model was. For example, here, I've got one master assembly file and my subassembly parts, right? So keeping structure was always on by default, right? If I uncheck that, then when it brings my model in, then I'll actually get a big list of all the parts and it'll ignore the structure. One really nice thing for those of you who are working with large assemblies is the addition of grouping by materials. Because if I were to import this and I have multiple parts, right, and within, in this case, NX, they were different, or they were the same color, green or blue, but in different parts of my assembly, they're not going to be linked when I import those. Now, when I group those, it's automatically going to group those materials for all those different parts, as long as they share the same color, regardless of the structure, right? And so you can toggle those on and off, right? But those are new and really, really nice. Otherwise, I'll keep this at the default settings. I'm not going to import the NURBS data just so this imports a little bit faster. And let's go ahead and let's do some work with KeyShot 6. How are we doing, Josh? Any questions so far, or? Sounds good, all quiet. All right. One thing you may not have noticed, but I can see it in my background here, is that when I created a new scene, it actually already had an environment in it, right? So this is a change that I really like. But as part of the preferences, you can now define your startup environment, right? So I tend to like using this 3-panel environment because it's got a lot of contrast to it. So now I just have that set as a default, right? And I don't have to go and do anything too crazy. It's just one of the preferences that I can go in and I can change my startup environment for every single scene, which is awesome. Okay, so my model came in, and as you can see, it kept my structure, right? And if I grab a material, right? So let's say this Moldtec material, and I apply it to this part here, you'll see that on the other side of my model, even though those aren't part of the same assembly, right, it linked those models, and that's because we have that automatic material grouping. So a small thing, but really, really nice. Okay, and also if you've ever used the Moldtec material and couldn't figure out the scale, you'll notice that when we imported it and kept the original units, you can see that it knows that this was modeled in millimeters, so it applies that Moldtec with a 1-to-1 scale. So now I don't have to mess with the Moldtec materials. All right, let's talk about the Move tool, because the Move tool is new and really nice. So let's say we're going to adjust the distance between these eyepieces, right? Let's say I select one of my subassemblies here, and I can either right-click and move it, or I'll go to the Position tab and I'll use the Move tool. What we've done with the Move tool is make some changes so that it's a little bit harder to make accidental moves. For example, the little overlap there, right, between the 2 rotate axes and the move axis is gone, right? Another thing that we've done, one, I can drag my window around, which makes that a little bit easier, but now I can toggle these different translate, rotate, and scale options on and off, right? So if I don't want to accidentally rotate it or scale it, I could just disable those. And now I can move it just by grabbing that whatever little arrow I want. Right, so that's something nice that's been changed. Let's talk about rotating, right? Because before, whenever you rotate a model, or currently in KeyShot 5, whenever you rotate, it's going to rotate around the center of that object, whatever it is. Something that we've added, which was previously only part of the animation tool, is a pivot, right? So now what I can do is I can actually pick a piece of geometry. So I can either pick it from the list over here, or I could click in my real-time view. But now when I hit OK, you'll see that the pivot has actually moved to that part right there. So now when I click and drag and I pivot in my real-time view, it's pivoting around an object, right? So you don't have to do that with an animation anymore, which is really, really nice. It's the move tool has gotten a little bit more powerful that way, right? So that's new. It's really, really nice. Okay, so some improvements on the move tool. I'll go ahead and apply a couple of materials on here, right? If you're not using favorites, I definitely suggest working with favorites, right? So I've already created a couple of favorites and then added them to this group right here. If you've never seen the favorites tab in KeyShot 5 and you're wondering what I'm talking about, right? Well, any of these assets here within the KeyShot library, environments, textures, materials, right? Any of these, I can just select any single asset like a material, right click it, and I can add it to a favorites group, right? So now that Moldtec material is here and part of my faves group, right? And so I've got colors in there and environments and different things like that, right? So that's an existing feature, right? But if you've never used favorites and you find yourself using the same materials over and over, definitely take a look at that. All right, so let's go ahead and just apply some quick materials here. As you can see, these are already linked, right? Those are already linked. And I'll hold down Shift to copy and then hold down Shift and right click to paste. And now I have the one material linked on those two parts as well, right? So let's go ahead and apply a couple of materials in there. Let's see, we'll get a dark chrome, right? Double click on that. We'll add a little bit of roughness to the surface. Whoop, sorry about that. Jiggle the camera. All right. Oh, one small nice thing here is we've updated that perspective button, so you actually have the slider instead of having to type in those digits, right? But I'll just go ahead and apply a couple of quick materials here. Copying and pasting materials. Okay, and it's looking pretty good. All right, so, well, why did I apply a chrome to those lenses? Well, I just want them super reflective. That's why. So we're not actually looking into that material. One thing I do want to mention, I'll also try to pepper a couple of existing KeyShot 5 features which you may not know about. But things like procedural textures in here, right? If I use my drop down when I've worked on that metal, I can actually bring in a color gradient, right? And so on these parts, it'll actually, since those are linked, one is red and one is white because it's actually a gradient on those parts. But one thing I'll do is I'll just add a third point on there, and I can change the gradient type to a camera, right? So now if I look at those, the color will change depending on the angle that I look at those parts, right? So if you haven't poked around with procedural gradients, those are existing in KeyShot 5. I'm not going to focus on them too much, but now I have a color shifting lens depending on the angle that I look at it, right? And I know that's something brand new. I don't want to get into too much detail on that, but that's what I'm doing with that part right there. Right. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of new things here with materials. One of those, which is a really nice addition, if I go to my textures tab and I grab one of these labels, right? So we've got some logos in here, but if I grab this and drag it over onto my part, I can add that as a label. So that's nothing new here. But if I double click on my material and you can see that I have the label now listed under the labels, right? Well, first of all, you'll notice that one, my label is too big, right? So I'll just scale that down. But even if I scale it down, you'll notice that it's clipping a little bit. So if your workflow is heavily dependent on labels, right, and you ever see this this clipping that's popping up, well, what you can do is down here, there's a slider for depth. This controls how far into the surface that label is projecting. So if you've ever run into this before, right, I'm just controlling that depth, and now when I make it project farther onto the surface, I get rid of the clipping, right? Okay, so I've got a paint material and I have this texture, or excuse me, this label applied to it. Well, you'll also notice on under my list of labels right here is that every label now has a type, because what we can do is we can apply materials to a label. By default, it's plastic, right? So I actually have all the properties for plastic right here, but I can use the drop down to actually change my label type, right? So now if I change that to metal and I look at my label, you'll notice that I now have this nice shiny metal label on top of a paint material. And there's a whole list of these materials. We don't have all of the materials, but we do have most of the materials, and you can make a ton of materials, for example, off the advanced materials or the anisotropic materials, right? But for those of you who have been wanting materials on labels, right, this is big. But yeah, it's just going to be actually adjusting the properties for that label. And they all have the ability to add a color texture, bump textures, opacity textures, everything like that will go in under the label types. Right. Okay. Another thing that we've added is the ability to actually add bump textures based off of your parent material. Right. So right here, I have my paint material and I have the label applied. And right now I don't have a bump texture. So what I'm going to use is I'm going to use this little drop down and I'm going to select a noise texture as my bump. Right. So when I do that, you'll see that now my surface has this nice noise texture. Right. It's giving me kind of an orange peel effect. Right. Well, once you've applied a bump texture to a material, what I could do is just check this little box right here that says apply bumps to labels. Right. So now instead of having to model this kind of stuff and assigning materials to it, right now I can actually just continue that bump texture and apply it onto my label as well. Right. So that's a new addition as well. This will get a little bit more complex when we get into the material graph, but there is some cool stuff in there. We're starting to layer materials. Right. So those are some of the new features that are kind of that are there that you can kind of interact with like we always have in KeyShot 5 and prior. Right. What I want to get into now is the material graph. The material graph is a little bit more complex. Right. And on the website, I can show you some examples of materials made using the material graph. Right. Like this awesome padlock by Esben. Right. And there's a ton of stuff up here. Right, but if you look at this this image, you can see that this is one piece of geometry, the body of the lock itself, but it's got some dots in it. It actually has a brush in it, and it's got these kind of scratches in it. So how do we start working with more complex materials? Because there are going to be some new features that we add that'll give us that functionality. So I'll go ahead and pause this scene here, right? Because I'm going to open up a different model just so that we're not going to get too distracted. It's only going to have 2 parts, and we'll really get into detail on working with the material graph, right? So let me hide my desktop, and let's open a new session of KeyShot 6. If you're ever working with multiple sessions, make sure you pause the session that you're not working with. And you can either do that by hitting this little button right here or hitting Shift Pause. Or Shift P, which I did, right? So let me go ahead and open a model that I've already imported. This was an NX model as well, so I'm just going to bring this in and let's talk a little bit about the material graph. Material graph is a pro feature, so that is something to keep in mind, right? So if you don't have pro, this is something that you won't have available to you, right? The materials on labels, that's not a pro feature. Everyone has that, right? But the material graph will be a pro feature. All right, so in this scene, I lied, not 2 parts, 3 parts, because I added a ground plane, right? Well, in this scene, I've got just this kind of tank shape, right? And then some sort of lid on it, right? So what I'm going to do here is let's start talking about the material graph. If I double click on a material, that'll bring up my material editing tab like it always has, right? But a new button that you may have noticed is this button right here for the material graph. So I'm going to go ahead and click that, right? And now I see my material represented as this node right here. So this is this little window. And if you'll notice, this node right here has some little dots on the left-hand side, and it's got one on the right-hand side, right? This is how all these dots control the input and the output. If it's on the left-hand side, it's input, and if it's on the right-hand side, it's output, right? So what we can do is we can start populating this, and this will get complex, right? And the first time I worked with one of these, I was totally thrown off. It was way more complex than I wanted to get into. But what I want to do is actually explain how these work, right? Because it's not crazy complicated, and being able to do things like blend bump textures or color textures or enhance things like your shadows. This is going to be really easy to do using the material graph. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get out of full screen mode, hit F to get out of full screen mode, and I'm going to put my main window, my real-time view, here on the left-hand side, right? Because what I want to do is position these so that I've got these two windows side by side. So something like this, right? And I double-clicked on this material, right? And I'm working with the material graph on the right-hand side over here. Right, so let's talk about what we can do with the material graph. Well, first of all, I want to make an introduction to some procedural textures, right? Because we added one new procedural texture called an occlusion texture, and the other one that I want to talk about is the curvature texture, right? And that's in KeyShot 5, but not very many people know it's in there. So I want to at least make sure that you know what these textures are. Okay, so first of all, on this part right here, right, I'm going to go to the textures, right, and I'm going to use the drop down under diffuse, and I'm going to use the curvature texture. And this is something everybody has today, right? You do have this as part of KeyShot 5, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to disable shadows by hitting S, right? But we're going to use this in the material graph, so I want everybody to actually know what's going on here, right? But if I take a look at my model or my material on the left-hand side, what it's doing is it's assigning a color based off of the curvature of my geometry, right? So anything that has a negative curvature, like the inside of this part right here, let me right click and look at, right? Anything with a negative curvature, there is going to be red. Everything that has zero curvature, like all my flat surfaces, those are white. And then my positive curvature, my edges, where I have a nice radius here, or even a big radius right here, are going to be represented with blue, right? So this exists today. Those of you who are working with things like oiled bronze finishes and things like that, and want to be able to control a little bit more of the reflections on your material, or the color of those materials, right? I can adjust the color that you see on the material based off the curvature of the surface, right? So what does that mean, right? Now I've got red as negative, blue as positive, and zero as white, right? So let's say I wanted to make a metal, right? Even though this is a diffuse material, I'll just set the gray as 0, negative curvature, I'll set that also as a darker gray, and positive curvature, I'll set that to white, right? And the adjustment I made here was cutoff, right? I can control the cutoff of where it sees the combination between those two, right? But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this material type to metal, right? And now if I look at my material, right, actually we'll see it a little bit better. Let me change that to paint, so it's not as reflective, right? So now the color of the edges is a lighter color and everything else is a little bit darker, right? So just an introduction to the curvature procedural shader, because we're going to be using that one. Right? And again, this is in KeyShot 5, so you can play with this one today, right? I still have shadows off, right? But I want to talk about a new procedural texture. So this is one that we're adding, and I'll go ahead and get rid of the texture that's on there now, right? So it goes back to just being a blue color with paint. But now for color, I'm going to use my drop down, and I'm going to hit occlusion, right? So let's use occlusion. What the occlusion texture does is it for all of our surface, right? We've got all these little triangles making up the surface. The occlusion texture points a line straight out from that surface, and depending on whether or not that surface has a neighbor, like if it runs into anything, it'll assign a color to it, right? So for example here, right? If I take a look, let me hide this part right here. This corner is a good example of where this is happening, right? So let's take a look at this vertical surface right here and this horizontal surface. And let me rotate my environment a little bit so we can see this a little bit better, right? So let's say this surface had a bunch of little lines shooting straight out, right? For lack of a better description, a bunch of like little kind of hairs poking out, right? If it pokes out and hits nothing, then it stays unoccluded. It stays white, right? But if it pokes out and it sees something next to it, then it actually gets a color. Right? So here is white, but everywhere that this model knows there's a piece of geometry next to it, right? It is now seeing that as red. So that's what occluded and unoccluded is, right? The nice thing about this is I can use it to change, for example, let's say I want to add on a little bit of shadows, right? Anybody who's ever tried to render a white product on a white background using White Studio lighting, you know how hard it can be to show shadows sometimes. So for example, let me disable this, and we'll change that back to a white material, and now I'll toggle S to turn the shadows back on. And I see some shadows, but not as much as I would necessarily like, right? So what I can do for the color, I'll enable that occlusion texture, and now you can see where these surfaces have neighbors, it's red. I'll just change that color. Now I'll just change those to a very dark gray, right? And now you can see the model. Here it is without occlusion, and now when I check that checkbox, I'm getting this extra bump in my shadows, and we can use this in a ton of different ways. But helping with shadows and adding dirt, things like that, this is how the occlusion texture can be really, really helpful, right? So if I increase that radius, right, it increases the size of where the occlusion takes place, right? So shadows off, shadows on, right? So now I'm boosting my shadows using the occlusion texture. All right, so let's actually build the material using the material graph, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let's go ahead and let's make a new material, right? So I'll just hit new, and you can see here, warning: creating a new material will replace your current material. I'll say yes. So now it just gets populated with this diffuse material, right? But let's talk about some of the what we can actually do with this material graph. I just looked at the clock, and I got to make sure we get it through everything. I'm just going to change this material type to advanced, right? Advanced is kind of like our building block material. We can make a lot of stuff with this. I could have used plastic. I could have used metal. Actually, in order to keep this a little bit less intense, right, let's just use metal, right? So now I have this metal material, right? And what we're going to do here is let's go through some of the new things that we've added. First of all, if I add a node here, right, so if I add, let's say, a texture or anything like that, I could just right-click and I can add textures, right? And these are image textures. These are procedural textures. We also have utility textures, right? So if I add a utility texture, you'll see that we've got all these options here. And what I can do is I can hit color composite, right? And this is going to get a little bit in depth, right? But what I'll do is you can see that I have this color composite, right? And it's floating. These don't have any relationship. So I'll just grab this little output, drag it into the input, right? So now this color composite is defining the color, right? So it goes out here, comes in here. Now my metal, the color is being defined by this color composite. Okay, so what can we do with a color composite, right? Well, what I'll do is I'll grab a texture, right? So let's go back here, and I've got this concrete floor texture. I just liked it because it was rough and had some cracks in it, right? Well, I can just drag this texture into my material graph, and I drop that in as the source, right? And now you can see the color of my material is coming in through the color composite and into the color for the metal, right? So far, this just is a fancier looking way of doing what we've already done, right? But now what I could do is I can start bringing in multiple textures, right? So if you've ever wanted to combine textures, we can do that, right? And what I'll do is I'll use one of my procedural textures. I'll use that occlusion texture, right? And I'll also drag this onto my color composite, right? And then now if I look closely here, let's adjust some of these settings, right? We're not seeing anything yet. Well, if I double click on color composite, you can see that we have blend modes, right? Similar to what you're used to in something like Photoshop, right? So if I multiply, right? Let's take a look here. Oh, or let's actually do overlay, right? Anything that was white got lighter, and anything that was red, it got redder, but we don't necessarily want red. Let's say we want to boost shadows, so we make that darker, right? Well, now I can use this color composite to start blending these textures, right? So I know this gets a little bit complex, right? But that's one thing we can do is we can start blending these, right? And I can control the visibility on those, right? So just like your layers within, let's say something like Photoshop, I can control the intensity or the visibility of all those separate layers. Another thing that we've been asked to do, right? So under utilities, I'll add a bump add, right? And I'll drag this over to my bump, right? Because what this will allow us to do is it will allow us to blend multiple bump textures, right? For example, I could grab this image texture here. I can right click and duplicate it. Now if I add that as bump 1, right, now I have this metal surface, right, and it has this image being used as a bump texture, right? Well, let's say I wanted to layer multiple textures. Let's go ahead and let's add something like, again, we'll do something a little bit different. Let's add scratches, right? So now this is already scratched, but let's say we want to scratch it even more. I have a second bump texture, and now when I click and drag, I'm adding more textures onto this material, right? So you can use this to start to blend, your textures, right? And then you can individually control the weight of those, the ratio, right? Let's try scaling this way up so we see these a little bit better, right? So there we go. Now I've got my nice heavy-duty scratches on top of this texture, right? And I can change the weight on those. I can change the ratio on those to be whatever I want, right? So now I'm blending those two separate texture types. So that's what those utility nodes are for. We can combine multiple textures, right? Okay. There's some really nice things that we can do with this, right? So for example, let's say I were to add a label. Let's say this material is going to be a little bit rough, right? So we add some roughness to it. But I want to add some kind of metallic fleck on top of my metal. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this noise and dust texture that I have. It doesn't look like much here, but there are these little tiny micro flecks of dust, right? Hopefully you guys can see these, right? But I'll grab that and I'll drag it over, and let's go ahead and apply that. Let's apply that as a label, right? We're not seeing too much yet, but you'll see what happens here under the tree is that this is going to get more and more complex, right? But we can still control it through our kind of material, our standard material editor here, right? You can see that the label is still being represented there. But what's happening in my graph is now I see a more complex setup of all the materials that I'm layering, right? And the material for this label, right? So here I have my label. I can select that label and I'll change it to metal, right? And let's go ahead and scale this way up. I've used this one before, so I know it's a really small texture. But now if I look on the surface, right, you'll see that I've applied that image as a label, right? And since I've assigned it a metal material, right, it's actually reflective, right? So now on that little part right there, I'm starting to get some reflectivity coming from this kind of noise texture that I've added to it, right? So we're not going to go into full detail on how to put this all together within your material graph. I just wanted to show you this is really powerful. Appreciate your patience, by the way. If anyone's eyes have glazed over, my personal apologies, right? You don't necessarily have to get into the graph. And again, this is going to be one of the pro features, right? But what it will do is allow you to make more complex materials, right? That give you a lot more control by working with layers on a single material, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and change tracks a little bit right here. And I'll go ahead and pause this scene, right? And I'll go ahead and close my material graph, right? So Shift P to pause this one. Because I want to now talk about some of the new things with our lighting and things that are catered towards kind of architectural design, interior design. So I'll open up a new session and let's import an existing file. Josh, how are we doing? Any questions so far or anything I should go back to? If not, I'll keep on cruising along. All right. So let's make our real-time view a little bit bigger and let's take a look at what's going on in this scene, right? So this is a pretty simple model right here, but it's just a couple of pieces of furniture in this room with invisible walls, right? I just turned the walls off, right? The models are courtesy of Google Warehouse. Right, but one thing I just want to quickly point out, I noticed that this guy is floating right here. Actually, I didn't notice I set it up that way, I'll be honest. Right, but if I select that piece of geometry and use the Move tool, right, one of the additions that we've made with the Move tool is the ability to snap to a lower object. So if you've ever fought with trying to get all of your models to sit nicely on each other, right now if I click Snap to Lower Object, it sees that piece of geometry and snaps to it. Right, so that's a cool, but small, but really cool feature in there. This works off of your bounding box, right? So if If you've got some strangely shaped geometry, right, it's going to work with the bounding box in the X, Y, and Z dimensions, right? So that's just something to keep in mind, right? But if you fell asleep, right, it's just using the move tool, and then you can snap to a lower object. Also, you can snap to the ground, right? Okay, so let's talk about some of the new features with lighting, right? Because we have lighting presets. Right, so this is what used to exist under your real-time settings over on the right-hand side under your project window, right? But now we've moved it under a lighting tab. So you can see here, if I click through these different presets, right, it's going to turn things on and off. Performance mode, right, it goes to the lowest possible settings, right? The basic mode, right, product, but the new ones here are interior and full simulation. Let's bring up the wall and I'll show you why, right? So let's take a look here within the room. So we'll zoom in nice and close. Let's actually get inside the room, right? And let's go ahead and adjust our perspective. Maybe not that much, right? So we've got this nice wide angle view inside of our room, right? And I was looking through some of the requests in the registration forms for things that people want to talk about, and it was scenes like this. So let's go over to the lighting tab, right? What I could always do before was enable global illumination, and that would help. Right, and I could up the ray bounces, that would help. Indirect bounces, that would also help. That was part of an experimental feature in KeyShot 5. You just have to enable it in your preferences. But if I look at this, you'll notice that it's really, really grainy, right? And it's not giving me a nice resolution. And if I start putting physical lights in there, it's not going to help too much either. It's just going to add to the complexity. This is new. We now have, if I click this interior button, we have an interior illumination mode. Right? Or this is specific for interiors. It's different from global toggling these settings right here. You actually have to enable interior mode, right? But now if I look in my room, pretty quickly, I find a nice resolution for what my lighting should be, right? Whereas if I just go to product, right, it will eventually get to my nice resolution of it looking good. But you can see here I have a little timer going in my heads-up display. That's new. But if I let it sit for 10 seconds, it's still pretty grainy. Now if I just enable interior mode, right, and we won't even hit 10 before it looks way better than the previous one did, right? So the interior mode is new. So any of you who are doing interior renderings or scenes that are heavily based off of physical lights or global illumination, right, this is going to be a big one. Let's make this look a little bit better. I'm going to go to my environments and let's go ahead and just grab one of our stock environments and see the difference, right? So I'll zoom back in, right, and I'll use this forest environment. Right, so it's looking inside my room, right? You can see I'm getting more light because I am using an outdoor environment with a lot of brightness to it, right? But it's still staying pretty grainy. All I need to do is enable our new interior lighting mode, right? And now that clears up pretty quickly. So this is brand new, and this is really, really awesome. Okay. So I hear probably some questions going right now. This works great with light coming in through the window. What about physical lights within the scene, right? So let's say we didn't have this nice big window to take advantage of, right? Well, what I'll do here is I'll go over to my scene tree, and let's go ahead and add a sphere to our scene, right? And we're doing that. I'll click that, and I'll use the move tool, and let's just add the sphere. And let's place it approximately over in this corner. Let's say there was a lamp right here. I didn't model the lamp in, but let's say there was a lamp and it was going to be sitting in this corner, right? Well, what I'll do is I'll double click on that sphere, right? And what I'll do is I'll just change the material type and I'll change that to an area light diffuse, right? Now I'll take a look at my light. I have this really bright light, right? It's 100 watts right there. Let's bump that down to something lower, something like 40. Right, and with a single physical light, now I'm getting some nice illumination within that corner, right? And it is looking good, right? Now let's go over to the lighting environment, and let's go ahead and let's turn down the brightness in our environment, right? Let's go all the way down to 0. Now I have no more light coming from my actual environment. All of the light that you see in this scene is being calculated from this single point of light, right? And it's looking pretty good with the cast shadows here, my indirect illumination, right? Light bouncing around inside the room. But if you've had difficulty rendering interiors or working with physical lights, the new interior lighting algorithm is going to be a huge addition. Josh and Sean, any questions on lighting? Because otherwise I'll keep on moving on. Cool. If not, then we're good. One thing I will do, two more things that are camera related that I want to touch on, right? So under view, or excuse me, under camera, we've added the ability to work with a first person mode. So if I enter first person mode, it's going to look a little bit different, right? I've got some different camera controls, but what I can actually do is work with my camera, right? With KeyShot before, with the cameras, you always had a look at point, right? But now what we're actually doing is it's like we're standing there and my eyes are 59 inches above the ground plane, right? And as I move the camera, right, you can see I'm actually controlling it through this first person kind of camera. Right. So that's a new addition for us, those of you who are doing architectural style renderings and illustrations, right? So that's a new addition. Let's also talk about another kind of camera mode, because this is going to be also, I think, pretty helpful, right? So let's go ahead and let's bring that exterior brightness back to 1, right? I'll turn off my sphere, so we're just working with just our environment lighting, right? So a request that we've gotten, right, let's hit C to put this on a white background, and let me change my environment to something that's not totally blowing everything out, right? But let's say I was going to have, let's say this was a big tall building, right? Well, the way we look at our scene within KeyShot, we're following kind of the rules of photography, where we have, or what we see in the natural world, which is working with vanishing points, right? And in this case, I have a lot of perspective. So you'll notice that I have my vertical lines converging up, right? So this is looking at the world with 3-point perspective. Something that we've added is a shift lens, right? So what a shift lens does, and I kept this Wikipedia page open, right, just in case anyone is curious, this is a great explanation of what's actually happening, right? But in photography, you actually shift the position of the lens to change how it projects the image onto your image sensor, right? This gets nice and complicated in real life. However, within KeyShot, all you have to do is enable the shift lens, and now we have a button, Estimate Vertical Shift. When I click that, you'll notice that all of my verticals are now actually vertical and they're perfectly parallel. So now we can recreate a 2-point perspective, which doesn't really exist in the real world unless you're looking directly at something, right? But now at any of my angles, I can get a vertical shift to give me that look, right? Or let's say we had a lineup of mobile phone cases, right? And there's always going to be that vertical convergence, right? We can hit that little button. Now we don't have to worry about it. Okay, so those are some new things, right, for architecture, new lighting algorithm, working with our different camera controls. One thing I want to hop back into another model to talk about before we finish up, and I know there are probably going to be some questions, so I'll try to set some time aside for that as well. But let's say back with these binoculars, right? So let's right-click and hit Look At, right? Because this is something that I want to make sure we touch on. This is a pro feature, but I'll make just this part visible, right? But what I want to talk about is editing my geometry. This is a new feature, right? This has been something that I think a lot of you have been wanting for a while. If I look at this piece of geometry and I do something like change the color on that material, right? All of this is one solid part. Right? And what we'd previously have to do is we'd have to go back into CAD, change the colors on all of those faces, right? And then re-import it. Now what we can do, and let me go ahead and change my view right here, is there's a little button that we've added to KeyShot 6, and that is Geometry View. So let's take a look at this. This is what we see in our real-time view, right? But this is the geometry, right? So we're actually representing the triangles that you can see, right? And right now, these are synced, right? These two cameras are synchronized, but I can make this into a perspective camera, right? So now, if you look at my geometry view, here's the actual camera, right? That's the reference, that's the 3D reference for how I'm looking at my model, right? So geometry view is new. This is a totally brand new feature that we're adding, right? But tied to the geometry view is the ability to right-click on any piece of geometry, right? This is a pro feature, and I can hit Edit Geometry, right? And this gives me a little warning that says you're about to break your geometry and live linking. That's okay with me, right? Because I don't want to re-import it anyway, right? But now what I could do is I can split surfaces within KeyShot. I can split different objects, right? So I could, let's say I'd modeled in Rhino and I had 2 parts on one layer and forgot to change that. Well, now I could break those into 2 separate pieces of geometry within the same layer. You can edit your normals, so you can smooth your normals on a surface, right? And you can also close meshes, right? What I'll do is let's talk about splitting the surfaces, because here, what I want to do is make it so that all of these little nubs are going to be a different material. Right, so I'll go ahead and hit next, and you'll see now I get my view of all my triangles, right? It hasn't split anything yet, right? You can see that here's the name of the part, center hinge, and it's got these triangles, right? What I'll do is I'll select that piece of geometry and hit this button that says split all. Now I have this big list of all the separate surfaces, right? So it's broken those out using just kind of a standard, the default 45 angle splitting angle, right? All right, well, what I don't want to do is have, 50 different surfaces, right? One for each little nub, right? Well, what I could do is I can multi-select, right? So down here at the bottom, I've got some of the parts that are kind of that central barrel part, right? And for all of these, I can toggle the visibility on and off so I know what surface is what, right? So I can toggle all of those off, right? And now I have just what would be in my head like rubber nubs, right? So if I select all of these, hold down shift and select, now I can merge these, right? So now these are all part of one body. And if I turn those off, I can enable these. Let's hold down shift and let's merge all of these, right? Now I have 2 separate bodies made up of all these families of triangles, right? To make it even easier, we can name them too. So let's call this rubber, right? Because those will be little rubber nubs. And this part right here, let's just call that barrel, right? And now when I hit done, right, and I bring up my scene tree, right, you'll notice that I have some new parts, right? So I have the barrel and I have the rubber, right? So now if I go to my favorites and grab rubber and apply it to this part, I've broken that out within KeyShot, right? Instead of actually having to go in into my CAD application and break those all out, right? And then I could still go in farther and subdivide those, right? Break those into their own groups if I did want one to be red, for example, or anything else like that, right? But the ability to actually modify your geometry, use the geometry editor, that's a brand new feature for KeyShot 6. We've got a couple of minutes left. I do want to try to wrap us up in time. Anything past 1 will be Q&A, and you guys can stick around or not. That's up to you, right? But let's talk briefly about animation, because there's some cool things that we've added with animation, right? Well, first of all, let's right click and we'll show all parts, right? One thing with animation that's new, I'll open the material graph. We're not going to get into detail on this. You'll see, even though I had been working with the paint, right, and bump texture and a label, all just with my regular editor, here's the representation behind the scenes, right, for how it looks in the material graph. But if I right click, there are animation nodes in here, right? I can actually fade, right? So I can do fade by color or fade by number, right? And we'll have to get to these in a little bit more detail in a future webinar, right? But if you wanted to do material fades going from one color to another, now we can do those in KeyShot. So that's a new addition with our animation. Another addition that we've made, let's go ahead and let's create a new camera. Whoop, first craziness for the day. All right, that didn't work. So let's try, again, this is beta, it's unreleased, right? So let's go ahead and try adding a new camera. Here's camera 2. And for those of you who fell asleep, you just missed it. Don't worry about it, right? So now we've got camera 2, right? So I'll go ahead and save this as camera 2 in a different model. I'm trying to get through this kind of quickly, right? But I'll go ahead and bring up my geometry view. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I'm going to drop in a new thing for us, which is the ability to do a path animation, right? So I will take a look at my scene tree over here. Let's right click our camera and I can add a path to it. So let's go ahead and click. Now if I go over to my geometry view, let's change this camera to a perspective camera, right? So I'm looking at my geometry but I'm not having to mess with anything else, right? So I'm not changing my real-time view. But what I could do in my real-time view is, let's say our path is going to swing down. It's going to look inside this room. So I'll hit that little plus, right? And you'll notice that I have a new little, I've got a new point right there. And then my real-time view, there's something super interesting on this white wall right here. So I'll add a little plus right here. That's my third point. And now let's go ahead and zoom out. And here's my nice, we'll come back here and we'll add a new point. Right, but now for each of those points that I've added, I've got this line. So let's go ahead and hit OK. Right, and I will use my, I'll make this image a little bit smaller so we can see it a little bit easier. Go back into full screen mode by hitting F, right? And now when I scrub through my timeline, right, I've got this path that's being followed here, right? And I can see all of those points, right? What's really cool about this, right? So let's drag this up and make it a little bit bigger, right? Even if I pause my real-time view, and I change my camera in my geometry view to my active camera, when I hit play to preview that animation, I can see that animation, what it looks like, without having to wait for it to render, right? So if you're rendering really complex scenes like the interior of a refrigerator with lots of reflections and frosted glass, right, this is a really nice new addition for us. Right, so now I can control all of those as points as well too, right? So let's say for one of these cameras I wanted to adjust it. Right, well, I could select that camera, right click it, and now I can move it, right? So now I can change the position of that point in 3D space, right? And let's change where it's looking, right? Hit the little checkbox there. Let's say this one here, I'll select it, right click, let's move it. Let's drag it way out here, and then set it up so it's kind of low and looking at our model, and let's twist it just because, right? Well, now I'll change my camera back to my active camera, right? And now when I hit play, you can see what that crazy animation looks like, right? And I'll unpause my real-time view so we can see it happening in both at once. Right, so that's new. Some additions within animation. Path is just one of the new animation types. We've also added animated depth of field, animated field of view. VR has gotten some additions, and one thing which I want to mention, which we won't show today, but I can show you the results, is working with scripting. Right, so if I hit this little button right here, this brings up my scripting console. Scripting, this is a little bit complex, right? This is based off of Python, right? But what we can do is we can use scripting to automate tasks that we would normally do by hand. For example, right? If we wanted to render panoramic frames, right? We can use scripting to do that. If you wanted to render color variations, save a bunch of materials, we can use scripting to do it. I can show you some really cool examples of some animations using scripting, right? And this was done LM6 on Vimeo. He's got some awesome work. But all of these pieces of geometry, right, were actually individual pieces of geometry, right? So those were exported as OBJs, and then scripting was used to compile them all within one KeyShot animation. Or rather, scripting was used to import this model, apply the liquid material, apply some environment to it, render out a frame. So that was done in sequence to all of these. And then scripting was also used to combine those, all the individual frames, into an animation, right? So here's another example of some scripting right here. And this one had some music to it, right? But yeah, so these are all rendered as individual frames through scripting and then combined to create animations. That's a great example. LM6 on Vimeo, right? Look them up. Here's another really good example. This is awesome work done using scripting, right? So that's all I had as far as the presentation goes of some of the new things that we're showing. Take a look at our website, right? So keyshot.com, and then look for KeyShot 6, and there's some more examples of work there. We're going to record this and make it available online after the fact, right? So we'll definitely provide the video. We can also provide some scenes as well once KeyShot 6 actually launches. We're still just right a little bit late. Josh, how are we doing on questions? Anything that we want to address?
We're doing pretty good here. Let me look through real quick. geometry view and edit geometry view, yes, that is a Pro feature. And as far as when KeyShot 6 is coming out, we haven't announced that yet, but be looking for it in late summer. Does 6 retain the basic pricing methodology for Basic Pro? Yes, it does. And if you were watching the questions, you'll notice that animation will now be included with Pro, and KeyShot HD will have unlimited rendering resolution. Let me see, anything else? I think we're doing pretty good. And if you have more questions, hit up the forum. We can answer questions there. There are people sharing their work from the beta testing. So watch there, and also watch on the keyshot.com/keyshot6. You can see a lot of the images. We'll keep updating that page with information. And if you have KeyShot 5 or don't have KeyShot 5, if you upgrade to KeyShot 5 before the release of KeyShot 6, you'll get KeyShot 6 for free. So be sure and get on that deal before KeyShot 6 comes out. And in the meantime, have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.